With the help of some brothers and sisters, this podcast was created to discuss some spiritual topics that you may have questions about. The goal is that you gain a better understanding on the topic, but more importantly, that you grow closer to the Lord. With the help of my little buddy, kick us off.
Stop being cute.
Welcome to Stop Being a Pew Potato. I'm Josh Hudson, and today I'm with an evangelist from Atlanta, Georgia, Bill Sanchez. Bill, welcome to the show.
How's it going, man? How's it going?
Excited to record an episode with you today on a topic that a lot of people have questions about.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here with y'all. I know y'all had Ben last week. You had Blake a few weeks before that. I think you had Tyler. So a ton of guys that I know and I respect, and I've heard a lot of the podcast, and I'm glad to be able to be here.
I want to read a song, How Beautiful Heaven Must Be. We've all sung this song a lot, and it was written by Miss Bridgewater back in 1920. And there's this theme throughout this song, and you can feel it when you're singing. It's this anticipation of heaven. And the song's based off of, or was written from Revelation 21. And the refrain goes like this: How beautiful heaven must be, sweet home of the happy and free, fair haven of rest for the weary, how beautiful heaven must be. Chances are most people believe that there's something after this life, or they have this hope for an afterlife, which we call heaven. What I did today, Bill, is I did a quick Bible gateway search on heaven, just typed in heaven, and what I found that it was mentioned over 600 times in the scriptures, both Old and New Testament. So it's mentioned 600 times, and yet we're all confused by it. Some of us are confused because of a lack of knowledge for what the scriptures say. There's other folks that are confused because of things that they have been told when they were younger. What's wild is if you were to ask someone about heaven, whether it be a friend or family or whatever, what you'll get is all kinds of different answers. And it's possible that everyone's version of heaven could be different. There is one common theme that you may hear from person to person when they discuss what heaven will look like, and it's really a self-centered I or me, what we're going to get when we go. So, Bill, I say all of that to ask you, based on your past thoughts and experiences and conversations, what are the first things people think of when we talk about heaven?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because oftentimes whatever it is that you think heaven is will inform your life and inform the way that you think and the way that you live. You know, and oftentimes you talk to people about what heaven must be like, and it's interesting to get their reactions. For some people, whenever they think about heaven might be this place where there's this pearly gates, and everybody's in their angel, baby bodies, and everybody's got their wings, and St. Peter's at the door, and if you were good enough, you get to go in, but if you were especially good, maybe you get a VIP section. That's heaven to some people. To some other people, heaven is a place, and I think this is probably the most popular one, heaven is a place where you get to be with your loved ones. And it doesn't really matter how they lived. It doesn't really matter who they were or what they were like here on earth. And they know that there's this place where you all get to be together. You all get to enjoy each other's companies. You all get to kind of look down at everybody who's still here and kind of laugh at the things that they're doing and laugh at the way in which they're living. That's heaven for some people. For some other people, heaven is a place where I literally have a mansion, and everything that I've ever desired is actualized there. So in my version of heaven, the Red Sox, they're doing pretty terrible this year. They're always beating the Yankees. Or if you're an Auburn fan, Auburn is always beating Alabama, or Alabama's always beating Auburn, whatever it is that you're into. But for some people, whenever they think about heaven, heaven is a place where everything that you deeply desire comes to fruition. For some other people, whenever they think about heaven, heaven ends up being this place, again, that for some people, there's steps or tiers to heaven. And there might be 7 steps to heaven, if you get what I'm saying. And you start off and you're in the first level. And there's religious groups that believe that depending on how good you are, you get to work your way up into the 7th level of heaven. For some people, they have 40 virgins or servants serving them. But like you mentioned, Josh, the problem with all of that is that all those versions of heaven are really centered on you. And whenever you tend to think that way about heaven, it actually informs the way that you live here. And the point that I'd like to make with that is that if my version of heaven is a relational heaven, and by that I mean where I get to be with my loved ones for forever and just enjoy their company, then what will be the most important thing for me here? It'll be my relationships with people. If my perception of heaven, or if my version of heaven is this place where I have this mansion and there's streets of gold and there's this, if that is what heaven literally is like, then what might my life here reflect? Well, I might think that I've got to have a big old house here too, because that's what heaven's going to be like. You know, if my version of heaven is a place where everything, all of my desires are actualized and everything is about me being as happy as I can possibly be, well, how does that inform my life here now? Well, I end up living that way as well. And I think part of the reason why it's so important to talk about this, part of the reason why it's so important to think about this and to discuss this and study this, is because whatever it is that you think about the afterlife, or whatever it is that you think about heaven, will ultimately inform the way that you currently live your life here. And so it's important that we do things like this and that we study this sort of topic.
From what you just said, should we be focusing on what is in heaven or who is in heaven?
Yeah, so it's actually interesting because the Bible is a little vague as far as what heaven will actually be like and what will be there. And I think that's purposeful. I think part of the reason why that's purposeful is because in our own human fickle brains, we can't fully understand and comprehend what heaven will actually be like. And I'm not sure, if I'm being honest with you, Josh, that's the point. I don't think the point of heaven is what will be in heaven. I think the real point of heaven and the real beauty of heaven is who will be in heaven and what that'll mean for us.
Biblically, what will heaven look like?
So again, we don't really know. But there's a picture, there's a scene in Revelation chapter 4. And if you don't mind my doing, I'd like to read the chapter, really starting from verse 2 here, and understand that as we read this chapter, that a lot of what's going on here is going to be metaphorical. So whenever you see the word like, or there was something like this or something like that, understand that John or God is being metaphorical as he's revealing this vision to John. And I don't think the point is to try to understand all of the images that's going on, but I do think there are some lessons to be learned from Revelation chapter 4. And so I'd like to start reading in chapter 4, starting in verse 2. And it reads and it says, "Immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne was standing in heaven, and one sitting on the throne. And he who was sitting was like a jasper stone and sardius in appearance. And there was a rainbow around the throne, like an emerald in appearance. And around the throne were 24 thrones. And upon the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white garments and golden crowns on their heads. And out from the throne comes flashes of lightning and sounds and peals of thunder. And there were 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. And before the throne there was something like a sea of glass, like crystal. And in the center and around the throne 4 living creatures full of eyes in front and behind. The first creature was like a lion, and the second was like the creature of a calf. And the third creature had the face like that of a man, and the fourth creature was like a flying eagle. And the 4 living creatures, each one of them having 6 wings, are full of eyes around and within. And day and night they do not cease to say, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God, the Almighty, who was and who is to come. And when the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to him who sits on the throne, to him who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders will fall down before him who sits on the throne, and will worship him who lives forever and ever, and will cast their crowns down before the throne, saying, Worthy are you, our Lord and our God, to receive glory and honor and power. For you created all things, and because of your will they existed and were created. The picture continues in chapter 5, and if you actually drop down in chapter 5, it's not just God the Father, but the Son also shows up, or the Lamb also shows up. And if you pick up in chapter 5 and in verse 9, and they're singing the song, it says, And they sang a new song. Worthy are you to take the book and to break its seals, for you were slain and purchased for God with your blood men from every tribe and tongue and people and nation. You have made them to be a kingdom and priests to our God, and they will reign upon the earth. Then I looked, and I heard a voice of many angels around the throne, and the living creatures and the elders, and the number of them was myriads of myriads and thousands of thousands, saying with a loud voice, Worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive honor and power and riches and might and glory and blessing. And every created thing which is in heaven and on the earth and under the earth and on the sea, all things I heard them saying. Just imagine this picture here. To him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honor and glory and dominion forever and ever. And the 4 living creatures kept saying, Amen. And the elders fell down and worshiped. Now, Josh, I don't know about you, but I read those two chapters, particularly Revelation chapter 4 and chapter 5, and I'm not sure if I'm supposed to understand all of the images. Again, that idea, there were things like, there was a rainbow around the throne like emerald in appearance. The fact that it says like emerald in appearance, it isn't supposed to be taken literal. And so there's a lot in these two chapters that are kind of confusing, but I think one thing is pretty clear in this scene here in heaven in Revelation chapter 4 and 5. And I think what's clear about heaven is that God is there. And I think part of the picture about, as far as when I think about what heaven is and what heaven is supposed to be like, I think that one of the most important things that I'm supposed to understand is that God and his Son are at the center of heaven. I think oftentimes whenever people think about heaven and they try to perceive what heaven will be like, I think part of the idea is I'm in my house and then tomorrow I get to hang out and I get to go see cousin John, who no longer is around. I'll go to his house, and then, maybe we'll stop by God's house for a few hours, but then we'll go and we'll catch a game. The picture that we see here in heaven is that everything centers around God and his Son. That whenever we think about heaven, if you notice in these verses and in these two chapters, that whether it was talking about the rainbow or the lightning or the 24 smaller thrones or the four living creatures, and we don't know what all that's supposed to be. And again, I don't know what that is, but what I do know is that all of it is around God. Because heaven is a place where God is at the center. And it's not just that God seems to be at the center of heaven, but everything revolves around him. In heaven, God is the sun, the S-U-N, the gravity of heaven. It's not just that he's kind of placed centrally speaking, if you think about it geographically, but that everything revolves around him. He is the gravity of heaven. And it's not just that, but if you read in this chapters, everything comes out from him, the blessings and the life and the peals of thunder and the rainbows and the lamps, everything that's coming out of heaven comes from God and his Son. And ultimately, I think one of the most important lessons that we're supposed to see is what you see at the end of chapter 4 and the end of chapter 5, and that is that in heaven, all praise is being given to God and to his Son. Because as I mentioned earlier, whenever we think about heaven, I think an appropriate picture to think about is a throne. And as you think about this picture in heaven and this throne, I think heaven is about the one who's seated on the throne. I don't know what all heaven is going to be like, but I know that God is going to be there. And I think if God is going to be there and God is at the center of heaven and everything revolves from him and everything comes out from him and all praise is given to him, if that is the reality of what heaven is, we mentioned earlier that whatever it is that your perception of heaven is, whatever your perception of the afterlife is, it will affect your living here. If that's what heaven is going to be like, a place where God is at the center and everything revolves around him, if that's true of real biblical heaven, then how should that affect my life here? And I think, again, as we think about this idea and we think about this subject, part of the reason why it's so important is because the more that I can understand that heaven is a place about God, then the more that I'll realize that my life here needs to be a life about God.
I'm thinking about all the things you just said and trying to understand, like you mentioned, we get caught up in taking things literally in Revelations 4 and 5 and thinking about this idea of God sitting on the throne. My question that I have from that is, a lot of us may think this, what does God get from allowing anyone into heaven?
That's a great question, right? Because I'm not sure if people typically think about this. God's already there. You know what I mean? I think oftentimes there's almost this idea that God needs you to get to heaven so that he can somehow get there too and really enjoy it. Apparently, the picture is God's already there. He's already the apex. The apex of heaven. He's already the center of heaven. He's already receiving all praise and glory and honor in heaven. And so it's not so much that God needs us to get to heaven so that he can get there. He's already there and it's perfect up there. It's as perfect can be right now up there. That's an interesting question, this idea of what it is that God gains from offering you heaven. And I think that to understand what God gains from offering us heaven, I think what we have to think about this question, the question is, what is it that God has always wanted? And I think that the answer to that question is that what God has always wanted has been you. So you think about this, right? In Genesis chapter 3, and I'm just going to allude to these verses for the sake of time, I won't read them. But in Genesis chapter 3, what God wanted was to tabernacle with man in the garden. But what happened in the garden? So man had an option. Man could choose God or choose himself. And ultimately in the garden, who does man choose? Ultimately, man chooses himself. Well, God still has this desire. And so what he does is he continues. And you think about the next time God tabernacles with man. I think the next time you see it is really in Exodus chapter 40, after they finished building the actual tabernacle. You see God tabernacling with man in the wilderness. And again, man has this option to either choose God or choose himself, choose his desires, choose whatever it is that he wants, or be led by his fears. And in the wilderness, what does the nation of Israel choose? Well, they choose themselves. And again, you keep going. So God has to continue in his plan, because what God has desired has been mankind. And so the next time you see this again is you think about man building the temple for God in 1 Kings chapter 8. And you see God tabernacling with man in the promised land. And here you have God again trying to be with his creation, trying to be with us, because this is what he wants. And what happens in the promised land? Well, you read 1 Kings and you read 2 Kings. And again, what happens is that man has this option to either choose God or choose himself. And ultimately there, man chooses himself. And so God, instead of giving up, because again, what he desires is us, he decides to tabernacle with us in bodily form. And you see God tabernacling with man in the form of Christ. And again, Josh, think about this, because to me, this is probably one of the points that strikes me the most. You have God wanting to tabernacle with us so badly that he comes incarnate to tabernacle with us. And man has this option to choose God in the flesh, to choose Christ, or to choose themselves. And you read the Gospels and they put Jesus to death. And you would think God should be done with us, but no, because what he desires is to tabernacle with us. And so you read passages like Romans chapter 8, where God is nowadays trying to tabernacle with us through his Spirit. And oftentimes, again, man is still confronted with this choice today in 2019, and you have to choose you or you choose God. And a lot of people oftentimes choose them. And as you think about what it is that God gains, what God gains is people. But let me be clear about what I mean by that. God isn't just gaining people, because what God most desires isn't just people. In all those instances, he had man. What God has most desired isn't just people. I think what God has most desired is that people, what they would do with their free will is choose him. And honestly, as I think about the people that will be in heaven, there's different perceptions. Some people think, well, it'll be the best of the best, the goodest people. And I know that's not a word, but you know what I mean. The goodest people will be in heaven, but they're not going to be there because of that. If you think about what God has always desired have been that man would choose him. And I think what heaven is truly and honestly going to be is I think heaven is going to be a place where people ultimately chose God. That every time I was confronted with a decision, every time I was confronted with a temptation, every time I was confronted with a big life question, and I had to choose between me or God, that in those moments I chose God. When I think about what God gains you. And God gains you choosing him. And so what does God gain through offering us heaven? He gains you giving him the only thing that he doesn't have. That's your free will.
Everything you just said was very powerful. And obviously the natural progression is for me to ask you about why we should desire heaven. But what I'm thinking about is certain people praying. I've heard in my life, and I'm sure you have too, certain older people maybe pray publicly phrases like, "Please come quickly," or "We long to see you." And it almost seems like a generational thing. And maybe it's because of their bodies are failing them, or they're realizing that this isn't their home, more so than our generation, younger folks. I'm curious to know what you would think about why is it that a younger generation don't say that same kind of prayer? Is it just simply because a lack of knowledge, or is it that there's faith there? There's so much faith that they're worried that will happen quickly and they're not ready for it.
So there's a phrase that if I'm completely honest with you here, Josh, that kind of bugs me sometimes that people say. And the idea is that there's this perception, and I really think it's a misconception, that people think that the older you are, the closer you are to heaven. And maybe I'm being overly dramatic about this, but it's not like it drives me crazy sometimes to think about that. I don't think that the picture is that the older you are, the closer you are to heaven. Honestly, the older you are statistically, I was a math major. I like to think about numbers. I think, honestly, the older you are, the closer you are to deaths, maybe. I'm 26. I could also get hit by a car tomorrow morning. Like, you don't know how close you are to death or not. But whenever we think about heaven, I think a more appropriate picture, and I think the reason why older people typically tend to pray that way and think that way, it isn't because age somehow has something to do with your proximity to heaven, but your closeness to God does. And I think oftentimes the reason why the younger generation, whatever generation that is, whoever, you think about it, the older generation now, whenever they were younger, their older generation was praying that way. And my guess is that the younger generation was not. Because again, I think the picture is that the closer you are to God, the closer you are to heaven. And I think older people, oftentimes, they're not as tied to the things of this world. They're not as tied to the sins of this world. They're not as tied to the desires of this world, to the money of this world, to the pleasures of this world. And I think that because they've cut off a ton of that, whether that's just from age or whatever the case may be, I think because of that, they tend to long for something better than what they currently have. And so I think it isn't even so much because they're older, they're closer to heaven. I think honestly what it is that older people typically tend to be a little more spiritually minded. And because older people are closer to God in their lives, I think they end up desiring heaven more. Honestly, I think young people need to be praying that more, and myself included and yourself included. I think that as a younger generation, that if we honestly think about how close we are to God and how close we want to be to God, the closest you're going to be to him is whenever you're with him perfectly in heaven. And so that Lord come quickly needs to be Lord come quickly now. Not Lord come quickly after I have kids, or Lord come quickly after I get this promotion, or Lord come quickly after my team wins this game, or whatever it is, that whatever your desires are, they all pale in comparison to what heaven must be like. And we just got to desire that so much more.
You mentioned the idea of what God will get. What will we gain from heaven?
Yeah, that's an important thing, because if heaven is a place where God is at the center and everything revolves around him, honestly, some people may not want to be there. At least in their minds, that might be the thought process. If that's what heaven is like, then I don't want to be there. But I think that to understand why heaven would be desirable and what makes heaven the way that it is, I think we have to really consider our reasoning for being made. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul talks about the fact that while we're here in these tents, our bodies, we groan. And we're longing to be clothed. And I think there's this idea that as humans, we have longings. And the fact that we have longings, I think helps us understand that we were created to have these longings fulfilled. And I have 5 things that I think people truly long for. And my guess is there are a whole lot more, but I think these are the 5 that are the most concise and are the truest for the largest group of people. But as I think about people, and the things that we long for and how heaven might be the answer for that, I think as people, we all long to have a real sense of purpose. You ever met somebody who's ever asked, why am I here? What's my purpose here? What am I supposed to do? And as you think about books like the book of Ecclesiastes, that's really Solomon's point in the book of Ecclesiastes. He's trying to figure out, what's my purpose? What am I going to do that's going to give me purpose? And you go throughout the book and you read the whole book, and a lot of it is he's trying out things here and things there. And there's these small senses of purpose, but there is no real purpose for man until you get to the end of the book. Because as humans, we long to have a real sense of purpose. But I think that we also long to have real satisfaction. I think people desire to really be satiated. And I don't think that we are here. I don't think that we can be here. You think about the last time that you ate. I had a Chick-fil-A chicken sandwich not that long ago. My guess is after we're done talking here, I'm going to be hungry again. You think about it. Well, what happened? Why weren't you satisfied? You think about up to this point, everything you've seen in your life. Well, isn't that enough? Why do you keep seeing things? You think about everything you've heard in your life or everything you've done in your life. And as people, even just with our senses, I think our senses help us understand that we long to have real satisfaction. And that as long as we live here in this place, in this broken world, in this body, we won't have it. And so humans long to be truly satisfied. I also think we long to have a real sense of value. I think it's a shame whenever people take their lives. And I'm almost understating how terrible that is. I think oftentimes the reason why that happens is because I think people don't really understand what they're worth. Which is interesting because you think about how often you have high-profile people taking their lives. And people who from our point of view, well, they're satisfied. From our point of view, well, they have real purpose. From our point of view, well, they have real value. And they end up gaining everything. They win the whole world. And they realize that they're not worth any more than they were beforehand. And I think as people, we're all trying to figure out what we're worth. I think as people, we all long to belong. Humans have this longing to really belong to something and to really belong to a group of people. I mean, you think about it. That's why people join clubs. That's oftentimes why people go to some churches. Sometimes they're not necessarily seeking a higher being. Sometimes they're just looking to be a part of a group that accepts them and lets them be a part of them. That's why there's all these Facebook groups. There's a group for everything. Because people long to belong. They want to be a part of something. And I also think that as humans, we long to have real intimacy. And by that, I don't mean a sexual intimacy. I mean real, actual intimacy. This idea where I can be exposed, I can be real, I can be transparent before you, and you're gonna see that, and you're gonna accept me, you're gonna continue to love me and be with me. And I think that as human beings, this is what we long for. And if this is what we long for, if we long to have real purpose and real satisfaction and real value and real belonging and real intimacy, how is it that heaven is going to offer that to me? Well, if we go back to Revelation, in Revelation chapter 22, and there's just 5 verses that I'd like to read. So Revelation, essentially, you kind of think about bookends. In chapter 4, you have this picture of this throne in heaven, and the book ends with this picture of this throne in heaven. And I want us to just see what's going on here. In Revelation 22, verses 1 through 5, it says, "Then he showed me a river of the water of life, clear as crystal, coming from the throne of God and of the Lamb. In the middle of its street, on either side of the river, was a tree of life bearing 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit every month, and the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. There will no longer be any curse, and the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his bondservants will serve him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. And there will no longer be any night, and they will not have need of the light of the lamp, nor of the light of the sun, because the Lord their God will illuminate them. And they will reign forever and ever." You remember these longings that as people we have, and just as a reminder, again, we long to have real purpose. We long to have real satisfaction. We long to have real value. We long to belong, and we long to have intimacy. Well, how is it that heaven is going to offer me that? How is it that this throne and the one who sits on the throne is going to give that to me? Well, that idea of having your purpose and having your purpose realized, these verses, it says that his bondservants will serve him. Listen, I don't know what you do for a living, whoever it is that's listening to this podcast. Josh, I don't know what you do for a living, actually. So this is good. This is good. But honestly, as you think about your reason for being made and your purpose, you were made to serve your Creator. You were made for the sake and for the express purpose of serving your Maker. And the fact and the thought that there is a place where you'll be able to do that, unhinged, you'll be able to do that perfectly, you'll be able to do that without any thought of failing him. I think whenever we get to heaven, we'll understand why we were actually made. We'll fully understand why we were actually made. Our sense of purpose will be realized. If you think about the idea of satisfaction, one of my favorite parts here in this verse is where it says that there will no longer be any night, and they will not have need for the light of the lamp nor the light of the sun. That picture there of there is no need for the light of the sun, I think part of the idea that we're supposed to get there is you think about what the sun, the actual physical sun, offers us here on earth. The idea of eating and drinking and living happens because the sun is where it is. And what John and what God is trying to help you understand in Revelation 22 is that there's going to be a place, and there is a place up in heaven, where the thing that you think you need the most here to be satisfied, the sun, you won't even need that up there because God is there and God will be able to fully satisfy you. You think about your sense of value. In heaven, it says in the end of verse 5, it says, "And they, being God's people, will reign forever and ever." Again, it doesn't matter how much you think you make here. It doesn't matter what people think about you. None of that matters and will matter when you get to heaven. When you get to heaven, you'll see what you're actually worth. Because from God's point of view, what you are worth was the blood of his son. From God's point of view, what you're worth is you're worth being able to reign with him forever and ever. And your true sense of value, your true sense of worth, let me tell you something, this world does not know what you're worth. Nobody here in this world knows exactly what you're worth. Your job doesn't know what you're worth. Your school doesn't know what you're worth. The government doesn't know what you're worth. No one knows what you're worth but God. And being able to be with him and letting him actually value you the way that you deserve to be valued, I think is one of the things that we long for and that heaven will do for us. Think about that idea of your sense of belonging. It says, and his name will be on their foreheads. It's almost, I think part of the idea and the picture that I like to think about here is God is giving you his name. I think when I think about this idea of your sense of belonging, think about there's going to be a place where you're never going to have to worry if you fit in. Where you're never going to have to worry if people want you there. Where you're never going to have to worry at what time should I go home. And maybe they don't want me here. Maybe they want me gone. Heaven is a place where you'll belong. And you'll belong for forever. And you think about that fifth one, the sense of intimacy. God already sees you. God knows what you look like. God knows you more than you know you. And in Revelation chapter 22 and in verse 4, it says, and they will see his face. When I think about heaven, it's not just a place where God sees me and knows me for who I really am. But I think there's going to be this intimacy where God sees me, but I also get to see him. And I get to see him for who he is. And here's somebody, and there's somebody, and there's a place, again, where I get to be completely exposed, completely naked, emotionally, spiritually, in every possible way. I get to be just exposed before our Creator. And I think that there's a place where you get to do that. And the person that sees you will let you see them too. So when you think about heaven and what you gain from heaven, you gain from heaven what this world doesn't offer you. True lasting things, true lasting purpose, true lasting satisfaction, true lasting value, true lasting belonging, and true lasting intimacy. And that all happens because you're with God.
For those who don't know, we record these episodes, and oftentimes we do it virtually. And so today, Bill, as I'm listening to you, I'm in Middle Tennessee, you're in Atlanta, and I listened as a listener, and I just closed my eyes and listened to the things you said, and it's very comforting. It's very comforting and yet also encouraging and powerful on why we should desire heaven. All that and all the things we've talked about, I want to end just by asking you, and I don't know how you're going to answer this, but what do you look forward to the most about heaven?
So honestly, I think God. When I think about my life, I'm this kid from New York City. My dad had 27 kids with 7 different women. My dad did witchcraft and sorcery and black magic for a living. My dad was 50 years older than me. And if I'm being completely honest, I don't know how many of you have children that are 50 years younger than you. But there's a reality where you don't get to share some things with your son whenever there's that sort of gap. There's just a difference in who you are. And I think especially as I started to read the Bible and serve God, there started to be a greater gap in that relationship. But when I think about heaven, I think about why I'd want to be there. It just makes me think about a place where I get to be with my real Father, the Father who has given everything so that he might be with me. And the thought that I get to be with him. There's a song on Zion's Glorious Summit, and almost every time I think about this song, just it makes me tear up. It says, on Zion's glorious summit stood a numerous host redeemed by blood. They hymned their king in strains divine. I heard the song and strove to join. You just imagine the picture there where what this conversation is supposed to be is you thinking about heaven and striving to want to be there. The second verse, he describes what it's going to be. Hear all who suffered sword or flame for truth or Jesus' lovely name. Shout victory now and hail the Lamb and bow before the great I am. And this is what's going on in heaven. Everybody's bowing and worshiping God. In the third verse, it says, while everlasting ages roll, eternal love shall feast their soul. That's the idea, like forevermore, what your soul is going to eat is going to be God's eternal love. And scenes of bliss forever new rise in succession to their view. And then there's this praise, essentially what you have at the end of Revelation 4 and 5, this holy, holy, holy to the Lord. I legitimately long to be with God. And maybe it's because my upbringing was a little bit rougher. Maybe it's, I don't know. Maybe it's a combination of all of that. But the more I study my Bible, the more I spend time as a child of God, the more I want heaven, not because I'm afraid of going to hell. That's true. I want heaven not because I just want to go to this place. I want heaven for God. To me, that's what this is about. And that's what this needs to be about. And I don't mean to be mean, but if we're looking forward to heaven for anything other than God, then you're not really appreciating what heaven is going to be like.
So, Bill, I think what I got the most from our conversation today and listening to you was that my view of heaven must be less about me and really fully centered around God. And if that's the case, my life should resemble that. Brother, I appreciate you. I'm thankful for your time.
Thank you for having me. This was really fun. I really appreciated this. I needed to talk about this more.
Thanks for listening to the show. Please review, share,